Hello and welcome to episode 100, an ongoing series of broadcasts designed for folk with the growth mindset or those who'd like to create one. Mindset Mondays is a project I started 100 weeks ago, just shy of 2 years ago. Thank you for being part of the broadcast. Thank you for being part of our 100th episode, and thanks for playing along. If you'll take just a moment and click share just underneath your screen, please invite your colleagues, your friends, your community to this conversation. The more folk that join, the richer the conversation. And good morning, Ian. We got a couple folks from as far away as Singapore on this morning. So let's play, right? The quote that we get a chance to play with today is a quote from Viktor Frankl. And that is, when we're no longer able to change a situation, we're challenged to change ourselves. And I don't know, this one sort of struck me. You know, as I said in the email that preceded this episode, yes, I wish I had a magic wand, right? There are so many things that I would change. And, you know, jokingly, not just the current US political situation, although that would be really high on the list, and the negativity that pervades it, because I think that's poisoning our culture right now. Sadly, there are no magic wands, and I think a wish is just a fantastical plot twist. It's not something that we can count on, rely upon. I came up through the early years in business with the belief that hope is not a strategy. Yet I can't tell you how long I spent in my early career hoping that things would work out. So this is not a place to play, right? At least not in terms of this quote. Thankfully, there's one thing that we can always change, and that goes back to Victor's quote. We are no longer able to change a situation. We are challenged to change ourselves. I mean, when you look back at Viktor Frankl's life, he's a victim of the Holocaust, or survived the Holocaust. And there's another quote of his that from Man's Search for Meaning that I think helps give context to this. He says, everything can be taken from a man but one thing, the last of the human freedoms, to choose one's attitude in any given set of circumstances, to choose one's own way. and as a survivor of the Holocaust, instead of drowning the bitterness and hate, that he poured all of his energy into developing a spiritual aspect of psychotherapy, right? But not necessarily a religious spirituality. His idea is this is the core, the essence of what makes us human version of psychotherapy. Great man, great heart, brilliant mind, pioneering, amongst other things, therapy for children and young adults. What he called his discipline was logotherapy, and fascinating take on psychotherapy, and that's for another conversation. But that gives you some context into the origin of this quote. And for me, historically, whenever I've tried to change things around me, or when I've paused the battle long enough to listen deeply, I found success shifting the battle to the internal. I had a very physical reminder of that on the way back from Africa a little over a week ago. You know, it's a 14-hour flight. So sleep cycles are fried. But I was sharing this on my mastermind call. It was such a high for 2 weeks, being reconnected to the ground, reconnected to nature, reconnected to the land and the origins of life. And that's a remarkable energetic experience, right? And I had that opportunity. And we did this trip with family. We had all of our kids, including my eldest child's fiance. So it's the 6 of us off the grid in Africa. And it was absolutely an emotional and spiritual and physical high. And on the way back, I started to feel the dip coming. On the plane, I started to feel the dip coming. And it was a hole, and I got sucked in. And I kept trying to change things around me. I got sort of the double whammy. So the book, the Mindset Mondays book, was theoretically supposed to be available for sale. It was launching on Groundhog Day to make this a nice, symmetry of this project started on Groundhog Day and the book was going to launch on Groundhog Day. Alas, I got back and found that the publisher had made not progress against the things that we had scheduled for them to be doing over the 3 weeks between the time I last spoke to them and when I returned. They made progress on nothing. And so that set the spiral that was already going into high speed. And I noticed that I went into high gear in trying to change the situation. And I'll keep the story short, but it ended with me on the phone with the global director at this international publisher, having quite the firm conversation. I am a firm believer in never accept no for an answer from someone who couldn't have said yes in the first place. So I kept going up the food chain. And although they doubled and redoubled their efforts to move things forward and rallied their troops to get it moving, it became apparent that they were incapable of getting done what needed to be done to move this project forward. And when I was no longer able to change the situation, when I could no longer shift the parameters outside, I had to shift the battle to the internal. Instead of leaning into that dark, I had to do the work internally. So first, it was to work on myself to recalibrate what the expectations were. I had to deal with the internal version of the external. And then when I reset the calendar and reset expectations on the book, more on that later, I had to start working on the internal battle and for me, for that depression, for the dip. And there's only one way to deal with that, and that's neurochemically. And that means to move my ass. And that was to start exercising, to shift what I put in my body and to start doing what I could to serve me, right? To do the meditative work, to do the physical work, to do all the things on my body, on the internal, to get out of that dip. To stop trying to change the situation around me and lean into that challenge of changing myself. Thanks, sir. Lots of cool wishes from folks in the chat, congratulating on the 100th episode, and thank you. I really appreciate that. And the other part is, and that's a great segue because it was also leaning into the work that's going well, leaning into the accomplishments, leaning into celebration, leaning into the things that will make a difference in my world and in my heart and in my head, and to stop trying to create outside things that would ameliorate what was going on inside. It's so easy to try to change others or change the situation or change the world around you and change the world around me. That's a lot harder. It's so much easier to work on changing ourselves. Never seek to change someone else. Can only change ourselves. Thank you, Lisa. And so where are the places in your world that you struggle to change what's outside, whether it's someone else or something else? Where are the places in your world where you try to change what's outside instead of leaning into the one place you have ultimate power and ultimate control, leaning into that challenge to change yourself? So what's coming up for me as I'm having this conversation with you is, wow, why is it that, that it's so easy for us to fall into trying to do work that's undoable. What is the attraction to trying to change what's outside instead of trying to change what's inside? Why do we lean outward first instead of inward? What is it within our, I mean, this is a bigger question, and it may be a rhetorical question for now, but what is it that in our acculturation or education process that has us trying to change externally instead of doing the work internally? Where does that fascination come from? I don't know. But it's fascinating. It's, in my coaching, both as a coach and as the coachee, how often is the topic, why can't they just? I wish they would. If they would just. Elaine works with parents of kids with complex needs, and I hear that conversation all the time, where parents will say of a kid, why don't they just? When a kid is incapable of what the parent is saying, why don't they just? It makes for a crippling impact on their self-esteem. Well, maybe I'm answering my own question. Emily Gale, thanks. I'm trying to do 25 intentional actions every day. Actions change things. It's interesting. Elaine's has a challenge going on right now about intentional movement. Every day, doing something intentional, whether it's walking upstairs instead of taking the escalator or the elevator, or doing Pilates or yoga or working out. And I got up this morning and got on the bike and tried to move my body, because I can't just snap the fingers and make the chemistry in my body change. That's a longer exercise. But as soon as I turned the energy internal, as soon as I got out of the, thank you, Irv, as soon as I got out of the victim story, as soon as I got out of living that reported on life and started creating, as soon as I started exercising, my energy shifted. It's easier to stay focused, stay centered, stay on message and on purpose, and do what I know changes my body, my heart, and my mind by moving. So what are the ways you change your world? What are the ways you do battle internally? When you lean into the challenge to change yourself, what are the techniques that work? What changes things for you? What shifts things for you? When you lean into living a created life instead of a reported upon life, what works for you? And what's your tell? How do you know when the slide starts? How do you know when you're pushing your attention to changing the external instead of changing the internal? I'm curious, for those who don't have, who are not dealing with or suffering from depression, those of us who do tend to have a physical tell. And I make up that that's easier when you have the physical tell. But I wonder, and this may be the context of a lot of coaching calls this week, and I'm curious, how do you know when you're imbalanced towards trying to change the situation and work on the external instead of working on the one thing over which you have ultimate control? How do you know when you've slid to the external? And I'd love you to share that. I'd love you to either here in the chat or to come to facebook.com/group/Mindset Mondays. Come to episode 100 and share what you do to shift back to that challenge of changing yourself. And what do you pull from that? Len and Irv, I know that this is an area that you do work in as well. So how do you shift to working on the internal? How do you know when it's time? How do you know when you've calibrated to working on the external? By the way, there's about a 10 to 12 second lag time between live. So it takes a minute for it to show. And thanks, my lens has my default button of awareness isn't always on. Or at best, there's a delay. I feel you. And Irv says, I'm in my head, problem solving mode. Not in touch with emotions, not connected to my heart. Irv, I feel you. That one of the conversations I have is about taking that 18-inch journey from head to heart. It's getting out of your head and back into your heart. Problem solving, figuring it out versus feeling it out. And I think that's a big piece of this, where so many of us get so much reward or accolade or success in figuring things out and thinking things out and being in our head, when in fact the one way to solve the things that are the deepest challenges is heart forward, head high, not head in. And I think that's a big piece. The rewards for feeling it out, for coming from our heart, are internal rewards as well. So there's that shift. When we truly want to lean into that challenge to change ourselves, success in that challenge comes from the heart, I believe. So thank you for playing along this morning. Thank you for diving in on episode 100. And I really appreciate if you'd share this. We are weeks away from having all of the audios for these edited down and dropped in to an Apple podcast. I really appreciate the support. So the more you can be part of these conversations during or afterwards when they're still stored on Facebook, I appreciate it. It really deepens the richness in these conversations. So the opportunity this week is to look at where you're shifted into trying to change the situation and to work on the external, and accept that challenge to lean in to changing yourself. It's the only arena over which you have ultimate control. So between now and next week, what mindset will you choose?